Complication. Shifters Forever Worlds. By L. Thorne. Chapter 1. Black Panther shifter Laken Araya shoved the notice back in the envelope and turned to her sisters Cadence and Karina. I have to. It's the right thing to do. Damn it. You can't do this, Laken. You need to tell them you can't serve. We never get to see you. This vacation. Cade's olive complexion was shaded with an angry red hue, her black eyes glittering. When will you come home? To stay? True. Laken was hardly ever home. She spent most of her time overseas in one country or another, serving as a doctor. How could she not? She had a cause. She knew firsthand the devastating effects of landmines. She couldn't bear the idea of not helping others. What I don't want now is a lecture on my life choices. She studied the return address stamped on the envelope in bold black letters. SSC. New York, New York. Every shifter knew what SSC stood for, Shifter Supreme Court. Well, maybe not every shifter, but for certain the ones that were in the database of the SSC. Laken jammed the envelope in her purse. We can reschedule the vacation, Karina. Cozumel isn't going anywhere. Yeah, but you are. You're leaving right after you do this thing with the SSC, right? Where to this time? Karina turned away, looking out the window. Laken knew this was Karina's attempt to keep her emotions hidden. She followed her sister and put her arm around her. This thing was Laken's summons to serve as a judge on the SSC for a case. Africa, Laken whispered, answering Karina's question about where she was going. She and her sisters had no one else in this whole world but each other. Laken felt like shit for leaving her sisters behind, but she had to go. Kate fisted her hands, raised them chest level and dropped them. At the same time she exclaimed, I knew it. Her hair had loosened from its ponytail and cascaded around her face, tendrils sticking to her skin. She was still in her yoga outfit, and a light sheen of perspiration shone on her face. Karina turned away from the window overlooking Central Park, her obsidian eyes sparking with anger. You're not going to get out of serving on the SSC? Not even try. The Shifter Supreme Court was nothing like the judicial system in the human world. It was based on hearings, and was designed to resolve matters peacefully between shifters and shifter clans. After many years of battles between clans over territories, rights, and other matters, the shifter community had formed the SSC. Judges for the SSC were pulled from a bank of names of those who had offered themselves for the cause. Not all shifters opted for this route. Several still elected to use violence to resolve disputes. Laken Araya had put her name in the bank for serving when she returned from her service in the Middle East. She'd seen enough violence against humans and shifters. She and her sisters had lost their parents to violence of shifters on shifters. And these days she saw way too much violence in war zones. No, there was no way in hell Laken wasn't going to do her duty. No. I'm serving. I'm not going to try to get out of it. Cade stomped her foot. Karina turned back toward the window. Both her sisters were disappointed. Laken got that. She exhaled. Her younger sisters didn't understand it. Maybe they never would. They hadn't lost a leg.
Chapter 2. Shifter Malachi Romanoff, Ky, to his family and close friends, knocked on Uncle Mikhail and Aunt Miriam's front door. The monthly Sunday dinner. Each week, his brothers and aunt and uncle all gathered to share a meal. When their cousins were in town, they joined in too, but all of Mikhail and Miriam's offspring lived out of town. It was interesting that the ones who'd stayed in New York were Ky and his brothers. His polar bear shifter hearing picked up the sounds of merriment on the other side of the door, and a smile crept to Ky's face. His aunt and uncle were the closest thing he and his brothers had to parents since they'd lost their own. Come in, Malachi. It's unlocked. Mikhail's baritone came through the wood. Ky turned the handle and cracked the door a few inches. Welcome, nephew. Aunt Miriam, a voluptuous woman with red hair and a sweet temperament, except when she was irked, adored Ky and it showed in her smile. She wrapped her arms around him. "I have your favorite," she whispered. Ky almost laughed out loud. Shifters could hear far better than humans. She wasn't hiding her statement from anyone. Anyway, he'd already smelled the blueberry muffins. Ky leaned in and gave her a kiss on the cheek. She giggled and pushed him away. "You should come around more often," she chastised him. "I thought I'd see you more after you came back from the Middle East." She pouted. "Your brother beat you here." "I know, I scented him." "When are you going to bring a young lady home for us to meet? Isn't it time you had happiness of your own?" She rubbed his arm as if she was consoling herself. Ky motioned for her to precede him, resisting the urge to shake his head at her matchmaking wishes. His uncle and brother Isaac were waiting in the middle of the study, drinks in hand. Curvy, Mikhail's favorite. Though alcohol didn't affect Shifters, he liked the flavor. "Give me a cold ale anytime." Ky humored his uncle and took a snifter. After exchanging pleasantries, Ky turned to his brother Isaac. "Where's Jonah?" "Their other brother." "How'd you beat me here?" "He couldn't make it." "Check your phone." "He left a text." Isaac rubbed his eyes, the dark circles prevalent. "I haven't been to bed yet." As an NYPD detective, he often wore a haggard look to their Sunday dinners, but today he looked particularly bad. The cat burglar. A scowl formed and planted itself on Isaac's face. "I saw that on the news." Aunt Miriam passed a tray of finger food appetizers around. "They said that they were calling in reinforcements." "I'm the reinforcements," Isaac said. "I'm officially on the case now." "What about you?" He turned to Ky. "Anything going on with the SSC?" "Nah. I'm between cases." Ky served as one of the representatives for the Shifter Supreme Court, which was very different from the human judicial system. Representatives in the SSC were there to facilitate mediation hearings and clarify questions the judges might have. There were no opening or closing arguments, no objections, just a hearing, where facts were determined as best as they could be. "Guess who's coming to town?" "Gavin and Layla." Aunt Miriam glowed with joy. An Arctic fox like her mother, Layla was his aunt and uncle's only daughter, and as close to Ky as if she were his own sister. "And Layla's expecting." Mikhail boomed. Aunt Miriam slapped him on the arm. They wanted to share the news themselves. "I can't help myself." Mikhail didn't look like he regretted it one bit. Ky turned to Isaac. "So what's the deal with the cat burglar? Why's this case so hard to crack?" "Well," Isaac hesitated. Ky shook his head at his idealistic brother. "Why do you do that? Why do you live and work in the non-shifter world?" "Because I can make a difference." A shifter assigned to a cat burglar case. Ky laughed at the irony of that one. Isaac shot him a dirty look. Ky froze mid-laugh. "A polar bear is working on a cat burglary case. You don't find that funny?" "No. And I don't think it's an average cat burglar." "No shit." Aunt Miriam gasped at his language. Contrite, Ky shot her a look of apology. "No shish." Isaac clamped his lips shut just as Aunt Miriam opened her mouth. "Sorry." He turned back to Ky. "How else do you think the burglar has been avoiding capture for almost 2 years?" "I was just given the case. It was Dan Roberts. Told him I'd work on it while he's on leave of absence with his wife's health thing." "Yeah. How's she doing?" Ky had met Dan Roberts. "Good man. Too bad his wife was having to go through hell. They're hoping this new type of chemo will do the trick. I think the brass was going to pull him from the case anyway. He's better off taking care of his wife. Let's hope she gets better." "Truth." Isaac's voice was low, even for a shifter to hear. Ky and Isaac moved away to get another drink, and for a bit of privacy. "I think it could be one of us." "What the fuck? Seriously?" Ky couldn't believe it. But if it was, They had the right man for the job. It would take a shifter to catch a shifter. Isaac tipped the bottle. "Wanna ride along? Or are you in the middle of something major?" "Sure." "Nah, not in the middle of anything. Let me check in tomorrow to make sure David doesn't have anything for me." David Partley, the SSC secretary, also assigned the cases to the reps. "I'll call you in the morning." "Not too early." Isaac yawned. Chapter 3. The SSC building was a dark, stark monolith structure about 30 minutes by cab from Kai's home. The next morning, of course, he took a cab. Who the hell wanted to drive the city streets of New York when they didn't have to? Ky juggled his attaché case in one hand and a coffee in the other while he fumbled for the electronic key to the elevator. 6 o'clock had come quickly this morning. He'd ripped through his workout, relishing the burn, his mind on the case. The light in David Partley's office was on. "Got a sec?" Ky peeked into the dark mahogany-paneled office. "Sure." David rose from his chair behind the desk and motioned Ky in. He was a tall, lithe fox shifter, today dressed in a black suit with a blue tie. It's about today. He was hoping to have a day off to hang with Isaac and find out the particulars of the case. David sat down again, moved a folder aside, and opened a file. He glanced at the papers inside. "I'm glad you're in a little early. Clark had to leave. I need someone to fill in on a case, and guess what? You're the only one available. So much for riding with Isaac. I'll have to call him and set up another day." "No problem. Where's the file?" "I'll brief you. They're convening early this morning." David glanced at his watch. "In 15 minutes, actually. The hearing's almost concluded, I believe." Clark did his usual exemplary work. "Probably won't take more than half a day, and most of that will be spent on the judge's private discussions." "Sounds good." Ky dropped into a chair across from David. "Fedor Kozlov." "Hold on." Ky frowned. How would he handle this? He took the bull by the horns, the only way he knew how to handle certain kinds of issues. "The name Kozlov, I have history with that name. I'm not saying it's the same family, but I served with a Kozlov in the Middle East." "I know. I already checked. He's a distant cousin to the one you served with. And this case isn't related to your friend Gavin at all. Gavin's not just a friend. He's my cousin Layla's mate." Gavin was a good friend and had served with Ky in Sigma Epps, the paranormal arm of the military. Now Gavin was family. "I've never doubted your ability to be impartial, Ky. Should I?" "No." David smiled and glanced at his watch again. "I didn't think so. Here's the details. Kozlov's son is missing. DNA testing proves he has a grandson named Dominic Lee with a human woman, Martina Faulkner Lee, who also goes by Marty Lee. The child is a polar bear shifter. Kozlov wants full custody." Ky grimaced. David noted Ky's expression. "Exactly. And Kozlov's unyielding. He's an all-or-nothing kind of guy. So he wants full custody of his grandson." "Got it. Does he know he's got a new rep?" "He knows. But hang on, there's more. Kozlov's making noise about Marty Lee's mate having killed his son Vay Kozlov. He's not bringing charges, though, as there's no proof." "Great. So he's going to be one pissed-off guy." "I'll take care of it," Ky assured David. "Do the best you can. Remember the SSC mission. We'd like to see matters resolved in-house to prevent any violence. Room 408. That's where they're meeting." Dave took another glance at his watch. "In 5 minutes." He handed Ky a folder. "On it." "Ky, it's not a big deal. Everything's done. It's up to the judges to make a decision. You're there to hold Fedor Kozlov's hand and help out with the paperwork." Ky nodded and stepped out. He'd make a quick run to his office and then head to the hearing room. Ky strode into the hearing room, attaché case in hand, tie straight, pants dry cleaned, jacket fitting a bit more snugly in the chest than he'd like. Sure, he'd been working out more than usual lately, but he hadn't expected he'd put on that much muscle mass. He took a deep breath, worry gnawing at him, when his ultra-sensitive shifter hearing picked up the sound of threads threatening to give. Note to self, no deep breaths. The room was full, arranged with bench seats that resembled church pews at the back. 8 rows. In front of those were tables for the petitioners and the respondents. Petitioners on the right, respondents on the left. In front of these tables, against the back wall and 4 steps up, were the seats for the 3 shifter Supreme Court judges. A long podium-style table with a panel front ran the length of the judges' seats. Ky arranged the files and papers so that he could access the information quickly, as needed. He ran through what he knew of Fedor Kozlov's case. DNA testing had proven Kozlov was the father of Dominic Lee, son of Marty Lee. Fedor Kozlov wanted custody of Martina Lee's son, Dominic. Ky took a deep breath, the jacket tight across his back. Damn it. He couldn't work with this thing on. It felt as if he was in a straitjacket. He took it off and draped it over the chair. The sound of wood rapping on wood, a tapping cane, caught his attention. Wheezing breaths accompanied the taps. Ky turned to look just as an older man plopped his large frame into the seat next to Ky's. "You ready to kick some grizzly ass?" "Mr. Kozlov. What's going on here? Where's my representative?" "Clark had to go. I thought Secretary Bartley had told you." David did say Kozlov knew. Ky wondered if the old man didn't remember. The white-haired polar bear shifter had clearly not shaven or showered in at least a couple of days. Ky pushed his chair back to better face him. "I'm Malachi Romanoff." He extended his hand. "You damned well better be good. My son's dead, and I've never even laid eyes on my grandson until this trial. I'm Fedor Kozlov. Call me Fedor." Ky nodded. "The hearing is over. Secretary Bartley said that all that's left is a summation, and then the judge's decision." "My ass." Kozlov coughed and hacked, phlegmatic sounds that made Ky wonder if the man needed a doctor. "That grisly bastard Navarro killed my son. I know it." He raised his voice louder and louder. "He killed my son, and that woman he shacked up with never even told us about my grandson. DNA proves he's a Kozlov. My son went up to Bear Canyon Valley to get my grandson. He never came back. I'm sure the judges will do their best to make sure things are settled fairly." Ky felt pity for Kozlov, and then he felt pity for his former representative Clark. Mr. Kozlov clearly wasn't the easiest man to deal with. His case had already been presented. Ky couldn't do anything to change that. It was in the hands of the judges. "Mr. Kozlov." "Fedor. Just call me Fedor. Told you that already. Would you like a drink of water?" Ky had to divert the man from a rant in a room full of people. Why were there so many damned observers anyway? He was accustomed to no more than a dozen observers at his cases. Kozlov hissed, "It's cut and dried. I don't have my son. I have no doubt that Navarro's grizzly did something to him. And they have my son's son. I'll take him in exchange." "Oh, like it's just a trade thing, huh?" Something about that bothered Ky. At the respondents' table, 2 grizzly shifters and a human woman took their seats. Ky recognized their representative Braden Furnish bringing up the rear. Ky knew Furnish's reputation. He was a good man, a good rep, but they'd never been working against one another in a hearing. Ky nodded a greeting toward Furnish, who nodded back. David came in a side entrance, surveyed the room, took note of the parties who were in attendance, then spoke to someone on the other side of the door. Ky glanced at his watch. Almost time. David pressed a button. A bell chimed a sharp note, bringing the room from a dull roar to complete silence. "The judges of the Shifter Supreme Court," David announced, and held the door open. "Benedict Morris." The first judge strode in, an austere polar bear shifter, dressed as if he were taking a few moments away from the golf course in a casual golf shirt and tailored pants. Dale Carver, David announced. Carver entered behind Benedict Morris, looking the complete opposite. He tugged the hem of his suit jacket and brushed off the lapel, as he looked back and smiled at whoever was standing on the other side of the door. Then his attention turned to the hearing room, and he wiped the smile from his face and took the same route as Benedict Morris to the raised table. Ky glanced down at the paperwork, seeking the third name. Laken Araya. And Laken Araya, David said. A woman appeared from behind the door, wearing a red pantsuit that didn't hide her curves. Her coal-black hair offset a pair of equally dark eyes. Ky looked at her face and froze. No way. This couldn't be. This was a complication. The woman he'd never forgotten, the one whose name he'd never remembered. Her name was Laken. And in the most vivid recollection he had of her, she was completely nude, sitting astride Ky in a reverse cowgirl. This was a hell of a complication.
Chapter 4. Laken fidgeted with her bracelet as she crossed the room. She didn't like being the center of attention. As soon as SSC Secretary David Partley had announced her name and she'd walked into the hearing room, she'd felt the eyes of many on her. Hopefully, they'd wrap this up today. Her vacation plans were screwed, but at least the hearing wouldn't cut into her trip to Africa. She had a lot of work to do there, and a certain group of children who were missing limbs she couldn't wait to hug. She glanced at the respondents' table. The woman Marty Lee looked petrified. Understandably so, the petitioner Fedor Kozlov was threatening to take her son away. Laken glanced at the petitioner's table. Kozlov, the old polar bear shifter, eyes glazed over with age, face not completely shaved, had a tight grasp on the handle of a wooden cane. A part of her pitied him, though he hadn't presented himself to be a very likable individual. Then she turned her attention to his representative. She bit back a gasp and fought to gain control. No. There's no way. I make one mistake, one night, one lapse in judgment. And here was that lapse in judgment staring her right in the face. He was as hot as he'd been that night several years ago. Broad shoulders, wide chest, ice-chip blue eyes, a strong jaw. His hair was a bit shorter but still a dirty blonde color. A tick in his jaw muscle gave away that he was having a reaction to her presence. A bad reaction? Did he regret that night? As screwed up as it might sound, she didn't regret that night at all. In fact, she wished there'd been more nights. Then again, one-night stands should stay buried. Especially ones that had been committed the night before you left for a country you weren't even sure you'd return from alive. He was the replacement representative the SSC secretary had told them about yesterday evening. She remembered the name that David Partley had given them, though it had meant nothing yesterday. Malachi Romanoff. This was the name of the man she'd spent one of the most memorable nights of her life with. She saw the recognition in his eyes. She saw much, much more there too. She turned her eyes away from the blue-eyed gaze that was locked on her. Straightening her back, she made her way slowly toward the judge's table. I don't need this kind of complication.
Chapter 5. Ky watched Laken Araya cross the room toward the judge's table. Her back was straight, her shoulders were squared, and her gait was stiff. It almost looked like she was walking with a limp. He didn't remember her walking like that before. Who am I kidding? We spent most of our time horizontal. His mind flew to all the different positions they'd used that night. No, not necessarily horizontal. He studied her face, the way her hair fell and covered her cheek, her almost black eyes. They'd gleamed when she was in the throes of passion. Her full lips had curved into a cupid's bow that night. Now they were set in a grim and forbidding line. He'd seen a flash of recognition in her eyes, just before she dropped her lids and shielded her expression. What was behind that look? Was it a good recognition, or was that a flash of regret for what they'd shared that night? Oh shit. He probably shouldn't know any of the judges for the SSC. A conflict of interest was normally against the rules, but did it matter at this stage? The important stuff was over. The case was in the hands of the judges, and it wasn't like he could sway their determination. Maybe I should mention it to David, just to be sure. He bit back an exhale of exasperation. What was he supposed to say? We had a one-night stand years ago. That brought something to mind. She'd probably been told that there would be a replacement rep. Clearly his name hadn't rung any bells for her. That notion didn't make him happy. It meant he wasn't very memorable. He'd like to have been. He would have liked to have kept up with her. Then again, he'd forgotten her name. She'd told him her name, right? Fuck. It was one night. One crazy, wonderful, passion-filled night. She was going overseas soon, if he remembered correctly. He was going to the Middle East, shipping out the next day. And now? What was she up to now? That night seemed like a lifetime ago, and yet it was burned into his memory. The taste of her, the scent of her. He'd never been able to let it go. He'd never met anyone like her before that night. Or after. She'd captured his attention the moment he saw her. Dark hair and eyes offset by latte-colored skin. Her laugh was contagious and quick to come out. She'd just walked past him. He'd been on his way back to his friends, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. He turned and watched that curvy body make its way through the throng of partiers. Then the DJ made an announcement that midnight was moments away. Countdown toward the new year. Cries of 10, 9, 8 filled the place. Instinct kicked in when the DJ announced that everyone should get ready to ring in the new year with a kiss. The DJ might as well have been talking to Ky, because as far as Ky could see, he was the only one not with someone, not getting ready to kiss someone. He and Laken, both actually. He'd known that he had to kiss that beautiful Black Panther shifter. Her dark, intelligent eyes met his with a directness that made his heart beat faster, and his bear growled demandingly. The sway of her hips and the curve of her ass, coupled with a set of lips that were begging for a kiss. He hauled ass after her, grabbed her, and turned her around in a quick swivel. Her dark eyes had widened, and for a brief second he thought she was going to try to kick his ass, then a slow smile curved those full lips upward. He was in deep. Immediately. The second his bear recognized her panther, it was over for him. And for his bear. Happy New Year, the DJ cried out. Ky gripped her hair, twining his fingers in the long dark locks, and pulled her head back until her neck was fully exposed. Her eyes narrowed to slits but stayed glued to his. He brushed his lips against the pulse that throbbed in her neck. His bear's senses picked up the quickening of her pulse, and his own pounded a primal beat, matching hers. The room and all the others' partiers seemed to pull back, leaving them in the middle of a dark place where the only thing that existed was the two of them and the kiss he wanted. Desperation moved him. Gritting his teeth against his bear's desire to claim her fiercely and his own, he pulled her closer until her body melded with his, her curves fitting perfectly against his muscles. An agonized groan slipped from her lips at the moment his mouth captured the sound, swallowing it as his tongue slipped between her parted lips. Perfection. Malachi Romanoff, David said now, and Ky realized David had said it more than once. All eyes were on Ky. He glanced down to regain his composure, then said, "I'll need a moment." David frowned, then looked at the clock on the wall. 15-minute recess. What the hell, Romanoff? Fedor Kozlov's phlegmatic exclamation was more than loud enough to be heard by every shifter in the room. "I'll be back in a few minutes." Ky slipped out of a side door.
Laken watched him go. Now what? Was he going to tell someone about their association? About that night? Could she persuade him to tell the secretary that they knew each other, but not from that night? She could just see the scuttlebutt. Dr. Laken Araya had been removed from SSC duty because of a one-night stand ages ago. I'm a grown woman. Why does it bother me? It just did. She rose from her seat behind the raised panel and made her way toward David Partlay's corner. "I'll be back in a few," she said when she reached him. He looked up from a monitor and nodded. "Everything okay? Need anything?" Yeah, for that sex-on-a-stick representative named Malachi Romanoff to keep his mouth shut about our one-night stand. No. She forced a smile to her face. Thank you though. She slipped out the same door Malachi had used, picking out the scent of him as easily as if it had been the night they'd been together. She'd never been able to let that scent go from her memory, as if it had been branded into her olfactory senses. She paused in front of the door where his scent stopped. Here goes nothing. Hand on the knob, she turned it. She'd have to beg him to keep the information to himself. Am I prepared to do that? Yes. She'd do whatever she had to, in order to keep from embarrassing her family. She slipped inside as smoothly as she could, closing the door behind her. He was standing against the wall, his files lying unopened on the table in the center of the room. Laken fingered the lock on the knob and turned it until it clicked. He studied her movements, never saying a word, his face serious in repose. She thought of that night, how expressive his face had been, and found her body immediately responding, her pulse racing. She lowered her eyes so he wouldn't see them dilate with lust. She needed to get hold of herself. Count backwards. Count backwards. That should do it. 5. 4. She breathed in deeply. His scent filled her lungs, reminding her of the smells from that night. This isn't working. 3. 2. 1. Not working at all. Laken. His voice was deep, the sound sinking into her the way his body had sunk into her that night. Laken Araya. She pushed the memories away, knowing they were fraying her ability to concentrate. Malachi Romanoff. I couldn't remember your name. He crossed his arms over his chest, the fabric of his shirt straining against his muscles. Did you tell me? I must have. But she couldn't remember telling him. And she should be sad, disappointed that he didn't remember, but I didn't remember yours either. The words came from her lips as if they'd been pushed out, along with the oxygen that was so vital to her survival. Now what? His eyes narrowed. His pupils were dilating, then constricting. She sensed his battle with his pulse. She studied him, thinking the last time they'd been together, how she'd scored his chest with her nails as she climaxed while he rammed into her over and over again, his cock claiming her as boldly as his lips took her cries into his mouth. She shoved the memory away. I know you have to tell Secretary Partley you know me. He nodded. We can't let what happened that night get out. Is there something else we can say? She took a deep breath and leaned on the chair, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the chair's back.
Chapter 6. Ky watched her chew on her bottom lip, turning it into a darker rose color. He'd never stopped thinking of her. He wanted her. His bear wanted her. And he wanted more than a single night from her. Surely she got that. How could she not sense it? How could she not feel the same way? He had to ask. Have you thought about me since that night? He'd kissed her that night. Then he'd grabbed her hand and pulled her into a room at his friend's clubhouse, a room that he knew would be completely empty. She'd gone with him, as eager, as hungry as he was. He'd closed the door behind them and secured it with a chair. Catching her with a hand on each of her hips, he lowered his head, his lips swooping in for a kiss. He wasn't waiting for more of an invitation. Her moan was invitation enough. Her arm snaked around his neck, her nails digging into hair that was buzzed short, ready to withstand the heat in the Middle East. Her breathing was a series of small pants, drowning out the music and merriment in the other room. His tongue claimed hers, rolling into her mouth without subtlety, fully intent on its mission. He was met with a pleasant surprise when he found out she wasn't one to yield. She pulled him closer, making his mouth crush hers. Something he didn't recognize tinged her actions, but it fueled his hunger. He trailed his tongue toward her earlobe, then down the delicate skin of her neck, finding the tender little hollow. His hand eased her top up, and she raised her hands over her head to allow the fabric passage. What are we doing? Her voice was a sex-husky whisper. Whatever you want to do. Are we stopping? He lapped the hollow, then raised his tongue up to her chin, then down, lowering it until he'd reached the top of her bra. Not a chance. She tugged on his shirt. His shifter sight allowed him to see well in the darkness. He marveled at the creamy mounds that rose from the half-moon cups of her lacy red bra. When his shirt was off, she trailed a finger down his chest, toward his navel, and the downy path of hair that led into his waistband. Desire seized his breath, holding it captive in his lungs, as her fingers traced the fabric just above his hips. "Do you know what you're doing to me, woman?" He unzipped her pants, then reached a hand in, his palm over her sex. "I can feel your heat." He slipped a finger between her folds, holding back from entering the velvet passage. "You're wet. So ready for me." Her breath hitched. He teased her opening, flirting with the channel within, but not entering it, tracing her folds flicking over her swollen clit. She sagged against him, her legs parting, yielding more of herself to him, allowing more of her delicious scent to rise and fill his nostrils. He pressed against her clit and allowed his finger to dip in once, only to the second knuckle. She shuddered a sigh, and her eyes rolled back in her head. His cock hadn't been dormant. Hell no, not by a long shot. Now it twitched and throbbed, pushing against the fabric of his pants, straining for release. Yearning for her. He let a second finger join the first and plunged it in deep, a growl rising in his chest and in his bear. Yanking her pants and panties down in one smooth move, he crushed her to him, then pushed her up on a table and spread her legs. He pushed his fingers inside her again and again, faster and faster, kissing her and holding her as she reached a screaming orgasm that was drowned out by the DJ's selection playing at full volume in the other room. She panted with desire as she reached for him. She pulled him close, releasing the button and zipper that held him prisoner and kept them apart. He gave a growl of anticipation as she wrapped cool fingers around his hot, thick erection. Her eyes held a wicked promise he wanted to hold her to. He anchored her to him and lifted her off the table. Taking her seat on the hard wood, he turned her around and settled her on the one place he needed her to be. With a swift move and a deft twist, he was buried balls deep in her hot slickness. He reached around, one hand cupping her breast, and pinched her nipple, while his other hand found her swollen clit and began a slow, tortuous grind. Her thighs clasped him tightly while she rocked on him, luscious ass teasing him back, forth, up and down. It seemed that part of the time she was in beat with whatever the DJ was playing, and other moments she was creating a tempo that spoke to his bear in a primeval language. She rolled her body on his, pitching forward then leaning backward, as if he were the wildest of rides. Her back arched, pressing her creamy breast deeper into his hand, begging for his fingers to knead the full flesh. The teasing friction as she rose and dropped onto his cock was sending him to a place where waves threatened to wash over him. When she reached down, taking his balls in gentle fingers, rolling, cradling, a groan was ripped out of him. With one hand still roughly making deliciously tormenting circles on her clit, his other hand roamed down her body, over her waist and hips to the small of her back. He dropped his fingers, making tiny circles near the rosebud in her dark crevice. He dropped them lower and lower until he'd captured her juices on his thumb, then pulled his hand back and teased that dark area while her pussy clenched around his cock, tighter and tighter. The closer he got to that rosebud, the tighter she held him in her sheath. When his thumb pressed into the little puckered hole just the tiniest bit, her grip on him became fierce, pulling at him, driving him nearer to the edge. She gasped and pushed back. Ky pressed his thumb deeper into the darkness, sinking into the crease of her ass. Her rhythm picked up an even more frantic pace. She rocked on him, riding him hard, pushing him closer and closer to the fever. She whimpered, a sound only his shifter hearing would have picked up. Each thrust he made, each time she lifted and dropped her body onto his, slamming into him, was punctuated by a grunt and the wicked slapping of flesh on flesh. He moved his thumb in and out gently with their rhythm. She groaned, threw her head back and howled, her muscles clenching around him, tightening, milking, and drawing out his own climax. Grabbing her hips, he held her tightly against his body while his essence pulsed into her, filling her. Reluctantly, Ky brought himself back to the present. He hadn't had a night like that since. Nor had he found another woman like her. Laken had imprinted herself on his bear and his soul. Jesus. He'd forgotten how hot that first time had been. They dressed and danced the night away, then gone to his place for more. He'd never found out why she was going overseas, but he was glad about one thing. I'm happy you made it back in one piece. Her face fell. Not exactly. Her mouth clamped into a thin line. What? She shook her head and parted the seam in her lips just enough to let one word out. Nothing. Well. He cocked his head, waiting for her answer. Did you think of me at all? After that night, I mean. Her swallow wasn't only audible, it was a lump he watched travel down the neck he'd kissed that night. Had she been thinking about the same things he'd been thinking? Did she remember that night as vividly as he did? Yes, she admitted. Now, how are we going to solve this? I can't have this getting out. I'll take care of it. He contemplated an idea. This is so fucked up. Have dinner with me. Her black eyes widened, and her lips parted with surprise. What? That'll only make things worse. You can't be seen with one of the judges. Okay. After the case is over, then. Laken couldn't breathe. What the hell was she supposed to say? Was he asking her to have dinner in exchange for his silence? Why would he? She didn't have to go when all was said and done. Her panther screeched a roar in her head, almost pushing her to cover her ears. Dinner with this man was the last thing she needed to do. He was too sexy. Too much. A man like this would pull her away from her goals to work with the innocent victims of war. She needed to run away as fast as she could. But running away was the one thing she didn't want to do. She wanted to have dinner with him. She wanted a repeat of that night. Fat chance of that with me with him. She fought a grimace as she said, I'll do it. Dinner. A smile curved his full lips, transforming his face from that of a no-nonsense soldier to that of a bedroom-eyed god. Mr. Romanoff. What was she supposed to call him? That seemed too formal for someone who'd seen her naked once, long ago, when she was another woman, a very different woman. I've seen so much. Been through so much. Malachi, she corrected herself. Ky. He smiled. My friends and family call me Ky. I need to get back to the hearing. The judges have to deliberate.
Chapter 7. Somehow, Laken managed to keep her eyes off of Ky Romanoff, concentrating on everyone except for the sexy shifter when she re-entered the room after he did. No sooner had she sat down than her phone buzzed. She chanced a quick glance. Cadence's text read, If you can't go to the beach, we'll bring the beach to you. And there was a picture of Cadence and Karina on the beach in Cozumel, fruity frozen drinks in hand. The drinks were garnished with colorful umbrellas, and her sisters' faces were garnished with half-drunk grins. She bit back the sigh of frustration she wanted to give in to. She tore her mind away from Cozumel and back to the present. David Partley, looking uber-professional in his dark suit and dark blue tie, rose and pressed a button that rang a bell. He cleared his throat and the room silenced. It's time for the judges to deliberate on the case. The three of them filed out of the room and into a private room that was soundproofed against supernatural shifter hearing. Once they dropped into their chairs, Benedict Morris called for them to take a few minutes to review their notes and reflect. Laken looked through her papers. She didn't have much experience with SSC hearings. This was the first she'd ever attended. These people are putting their future in my hands. She'd listened objectively and had tried to weigh out the facts. Fedor Kozlov kept saying that Tanner Navarro had killed his son, but there was no proof of that, and Vay Kozlov's death wasn't part of the case anyway. The hearing had been established for the purpose of determining custodial rights. There seemed to be no doubt that the little shifter called Dominic was Marty's son, as well as Kozlov's grandson. That wasn't in dispute. The dispute was that Fedor Kozlov wanted full custody of his grandson, when Dominic had a mother who was more than competent and loving. Fedor Kozlov claimed his son had gone to Bear Canyon Valley. Credit card charges substantiated that claim, but the investigators Kozlov had sent there had been able to find no one who had witnessed Vay's presence there. The SSC couldn't charge Tanner Navarro with an unsubstantiated crime. They didn't operate that way. So Fedor Kozlov's assertions of murder had fallen flat. Laken had studied Tanner Navarro, and the way he watched Marty and Dominic. His bear glowed amber in the depths of his eyes, and though her panther found his bear honorable, there was something that pricked at Laken's nerve endings. She believed that Tanner Navarro wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect his mate and her son. And I don't blame him. No, she didn't blame him, and she envied Marty Lee for having found a good man. A man who would do that for her. A small sigh escaped from her lips and her shoulders slumped forward. She and the rest of the judges would have to vote on these people's futures. As cantankerous as she found the old man to be, she still felt pity for him. He didn't know where his son was, and he had no relationship with his grandson. Laken looked at Benedict Morris and Dale Carver. Benedict was older, perhaps he had experience in cases like this. "What do you think?" she asked. "I'm a father," Benedict said. "And a grandfather. I can't imagine not seeing my grandkids. There's no reason to take that child away from his mother, but maybe we could arrange for visitation?" Dale asked. Mr. Kozlov wasn't willing to negotiate terms of that nature. He said it was all or nothing, Benedict reminded him. Laken shook her head. "I can't see myself agreeing to that. I can't see myself agreeing to a grandfather never seeing his grandchild." Benedict closed the file in front of him. That was how the day was spent. The three of them in one room, lunch delivered at the halfway point until 6 o'clock rolled around. There was no majority decision. 1 for, 1 against, 1 undecided. David Partley poked his head in. They gave him the bad news. "We'll meet in the morning. 8 o'clock. I hope we have resolution by then. Please spend the evening thinking about the matter." He left the room. "Let's not drag this hearing out anymore." Dale frowned as he followed David out the door. "I don't want to spend my holidays locked up with you two trying to sort this out." He laughed, a sheepish grin on his face. "Nothing personal." "Yeah, as if this is how I want to spend my Cozumel vacation." Her mind went back to Ky. Had he talked to David Partley? David hadn't acted odd, but still.
Chapter 8. Ky and the rest of the involved parties had been dismissed. The judges had no decision yet, so they'd all have to return in the morning. So much for simple. David threw an apologetic look his way. Not that it mattered much to Ky, this was what he got paid for. Except that it added to the time he'd have to wait to have dinner with Laken. He returned to his place and stripped, then pulled a t-shirt over his head. The doorbell rang. Just when he was relishing a night alone, a night without the push and pull of the hearing. He wanted to revisit his time with Laken. Something seemed so different about her now. He also felt bad about asking her to dinner like that, as if he were exhorting her to have dinner in exchange for his silence. He needed to talk to her. He couldn't have her thinking he was like that. The doorbell chimed again. All right. Fuck. Enough already. I'm coming." He opened the door. "Isaac. Where have you been?" The dark circles were still under Isaac's eyes. His face looked gaunt, cheekbones still prominent. The case. Ky knew he could tell. The cat burglar case. Any progress? Nah. How's your hearing going? Same as every other hearing. Except the part about seeing Laken. Isaac looked at the table behind Ky. Had dinner yet? Want some steak? Sure. Let's go, but it can't be a late night. It won't be. It's being delivered in 15 minutes, Isaac said. Sly bastard. He handed Isaac a bottle of beer. They made their way to the balcony and looked over the railing. Ky took a long swig, then set the bottle down on the table. Remember that New Year's Eve party the night before I shipped out? Isaac cocked his head. Yeah, that was a long time ago. Ky wasn't sure he wanted to tell Isaac about Laken. He wanted to savor that secret himself. Then again, he and Isaac rarely kept things from each other. Keep talking, Isaac prompted. Man, I see how you got your detective's badge, Ky ribbed. I met a girl that night. Yeah, I remember. You bailed on us. Dark-haired, cute, curvy thing. What about her? Why do I feel like I'm in grade school again? I saw her again recently. Asked her out. More like I blackmailed her into having dinner with me, or I'd exposed the secret about our one night together that she seemed so eager to keep under wraps. Now that he thought of it, he felt like a damned creep. Maybe he'd be better off backing out. And Ky shook his head. I don't know. Never mind. Seems pretty dumb in retrospect. The doorbell chimed. Dinner, Isaac said and headed for the door. As he opened it, he turned back and looked at Ky, an expression on his face that Ky couldn't peg. Not dinner, Isaac said and opened the door wider. Laken. Damn.
Chapter 9. Laken stood in the doorway. A man who looked a whole lot like Ky was blocking her way. Boy, was he ever. He was as wide-shouldered as Ky, every bit as broad-chested, and he might even be an inch or two taller. He stared at her. His expression was even more unapproachable than Ky's usual don't fuck with me look. The man didn't say a word, so she did. Hi. I know you, he said. Laken flinched. Did he know that she was one of the judges? Do you? She kept her voice cool. Yeah, you were at that party. A few years back. He stepped aside. The night before he shipped out. The man gestured behind him with his thumb. I'm Isaac. His brother. Laken glanced toward the direction he'd pointed and saw Ky come into view. She's the one, right? Isaac said to Ky. Laken felt a slow heat raging in her chest, rising to her neck then lighting her face on fire. He knew her from the night she'd her one-night stand with Ky. Does he also know what happened that night? Ky stepped between them. Laken, this is my brother Isaac. Already told her that, Isaac said. He's got a problem with his mouth. He keeps shoving his foot in it. Ky gave his brother a dirty look. He was just leaving. But, Isaac started, then nodded after receiving a pointed look from Ky. He slipped around them, then out the door and down the staircase, not even waiting for the elevator. How'd you know where I live? Ky cocked his head, a smile playing on his lips that made him so very irresistible and reminded Laken of that night. I needed to talk to you. Good. I've been wanting to talk to you too. He took a step closer. Laken backed up until the door jamb was pressed against her spine. I wanted to talk to you about the dinner, the hearing, keeping it a secret, all that. She really needed to find out what he planned to tell David Partley. Go on. Ky pursed his lips, his brows drawing down in a V. About that dinner. I can't have anyone thinking I'm not objective. I have to be impartial. Of course. He put his hand on the small of her back and guided her in, closing the door behind her. After the case is resolved, then. Laken crossed her arms over her chest. I'm not looking for complications in my life. I'm not offering a complication. You're a walking, talking, sexy complication. She drew in a deep breath, ready to tell him that his very presence complicated her life and confused her thinking and made her body feel things she hadn't felt since the last time she'd seen him. The doorbell rang. Panic struck. She stumbled away from him and around the corner of the breakfast bar, seeking cover just in case. Who the hell could it be? What if it was the old polar bear shifter he was representing? He opened the door and spoke to someone there, reached into his pocket, took out some cash and handed it over, then closed the door with a takeout bag in his hands. Steak? He placed the bag on the counter and unpacked the contents. 2 steaks. 2 baked potatoes. Interested? 2 of them. Her stomach grumbled at the aroma rising from the tin platters. Oh no. One of those was for your brother. You're prettier. No contest. The uncontrolled desire in his eyes made heat rise to her face and then drop into her midsection. Medium rare good. He took steak knives from a woodblock. I can't stay for dinner. What is he thinking? Perfect. What am I thinking? Ky grabbed a couple of plates from a cupboard and reached for a baked potato. He picked the steaming foil-wrapped vegetable up and dropped it quickly. Damn. He stuck the burnt finger in his mouth and sucked on it. A dozen dirty images flew through Laken's mind, all of them from that one night, involving the things he'd done with his fingers. A blush began its inevitable rise, heating her chest and neck, making its way to her face, where it would be a dead giveaway that he was affecting her. Laken took a few steps toward the balcony door, looking at the view to keep him from seeing what he'd done to her. The rustling of his unpacking and setting the table came from behind her. What do you like on your baked potato? You. She took a deep breath and turned his way, hoping the red had regressed. The usual. Butter, sour cream. Grab a seat. He held a chair out for her at the breakfast bar, instead of the dinner table. A part of her was relieved that they'd be eating in the more casual area, until she realized that the bar was so small, they'd be forced to sit very close to each other. Great. Just what my libido doesn't need. She took her spot and pulled the stool up to the bar. So, what have you been up to since the last time I saw you? Ky took a bite of steak. The way he bit into the pink flesh made a slow quiver run through Laken's body. She studied her baked potato, stabbed it with her fork and pushed it around, almost stirring it. Surely he couldn't make eating a baked potato look sexy. Injured by a landmine, lost a leg. Lost a boyfriend, okay, not much of a boyfriend to be honest. Working for an organization that helps wartime victims, especially ones hurt by landmines. Not much. She looked up at him. He was still, his blue gaze focused on her face. In the depths of his eyes, a golden glow flamed. Her panther roared in Laken's head. She ignored her. What have you been up to? He cocked his head, as if he was thinking what to say. Then he nodded. I left for the Middle East the day after you, after we? That was the last thing she needed him to say out loud. She didn't need that night, that one and only charmed night, to be brought up and talked about. She didn't want the magic to dissipate, the same way that everything else in her life had. Why'd you come back? He paused, the hand holding his fork hesitating midway to his lips. Disillusioned. He set the fork down. A friend of mine killed an officer for making a bad call that got most of the unit killed. Including my good friend's brother. Laken didn't know what to say to that. She'd seen more than her share of death in Africa. You left and now this? With the shifter Supreme Court? Yes, and you? No mate? No baby shifters running around? No. He leaned his barstool forward, balancing it on two legs, bringing that big body of his closer, eclipsing her view of anything but him. A low growl came from deep within his chest, and sent a barrage of chills throughout her body. Her breath caught in her throat as his face approached. She closed her eyes, yielding to the emotions surging within her. Desire pumped through her veins, forcing parts of her to swell with the divine torture of being absent from pleasure for way too long. Really? No mate? He released the words in a whisper, his breath warm and all male, caressing her face. No. The word was a wisp in the air, torn from her oxygen-deprived lungs. His lips alit on hers, claiming her mouth. Her lips parted to his demands, and his tongue explored her mouth as if it were a new territory to seize. His eyes were glowing a white-gold flame. His bear and his lust were battling within him, and Laken knew exactly what he was going through. Her own panther struggled to govern and override Laken's self-control. I want you, he growled against her flesh. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her head back. His teeth raked the flesh of her neck, sending pinpricks of longing coursing throughout her body. A large bulge jutted against her thigh. He took her by the hips and rocked her against his hardness. Dropping his head, he gave her neck a long, hungry lick. She pulled away, wanting more than anything to give in. I let you go once, he snarled. Never again. We have a job. We can't complicate things. Does this feel complicated? His tongue lapped at the hollow in her neck, as his fingers traveled to the zipper of her pants and released it. It feels like heaven. It feels like everything right. She put her hand over his but couldn't bring herself to stop him, even though it meant he'd know. It feels very complicated. Your scent says you like this kind of complicated. The words came from deep within his wide chest, a gravelly growl sent by his bear. Kai's fingertips lit on her mound, then moved and tugged on her pants, pulling them down over her prosthetic leg.
Chapter 10. Ky froze, his lungs full of the scent of her desire. Her leg. It was missing. Both thighs were beautiful, full and wonderfully curvy, but one stopped just above the knee, where the leg was replaced with a prosthetic. Why wouldn't she tell me? He'd asked her what she'd been up to. This didn't look like not much. She was quiet. It seemed even her breathing had stopped and her pulse had frozen. This woman was the epitome of strength and beauty, and she was watching him for a reaction. But what kind of reaction did she want? The only reaction he'd had was a complete desire to make her his mate and bond with her right now. That won't do. No, it wouldn't do. It would be best to make sure that that was what she wanted as well. He leaned forward and kissed first one thigh, then the other. Placing an arm under her legs and one behind her, he swooped her into a carry and moved toward the couch. What are you doing? Her voice was a whisper. I'm going to make love to the woman who's been out of my life for way too damn long. That's what. His bear roared agreement. You can't. Why not? With supernatural speed, accompanied by a crunching and tearing sound, she shifted into a beautiful black panther. Her prosthetic leg dropped to the floor with a thud that punctuated her shift. She stood there, her panther eyes dark, glaring at him, her mouth parted enough to give him a glimpse of crimson and sharp ivory. Her hind leg was missing, just above the knee joint. Kai's bear growled in his head, then roared, filling Kai's mind with a sound that reverberated and inside his skull as he shifted into his massive polar bear form. She remained unmoved, ethereal, and yet primal in her panther form. Every bit of her was the woman he wanted, the mate he needed. A sound came from deep within her chest, a low chuffing that sounded mournful. His bear grunted and approached her, then let her lean against his bulk, their pulses keeping beat with one another. He pushed to establish a link with her, to communicate silently the way that shifters could without speaking. Let me in, Laken. He was met with silence. He was sure she had to know how to sync and communicate, and yet she wouldn't respond. Knowing she could hear him, he tried once more. Tell me why not. Tell me why I can't make love to the woman I want. Tell me why you deny me this. His bear stepped closer to the magnificent creature she was. Her mouth parted again, teeth lethal and white, tongue a deep pink. Her features were beautifully feminine on a powerful frame, neck long and slender, body muscle-bound and covered with shiny black fur. She released a low growl, half warning and half relenting. He came even closer, inhaling, his bare head only inches from hers. He took her scent in, trepidation, fear, and arousal. I want you. I've never stopped wanting you. She still did not allow them to sink together in their minds. You've been through a lot. A whole lot more than not much. Why are you so guarded? Where's the woman who turned my world upside down and grabbed my heart like a thief in the night and never returned it? With a snarl, she pushed off of him, just as she had in her human form. She shifted out of her panther, back into the curvy beauty he'd fallen for ages ago. Her clothing and shoes shifted with her, the way clothing always did with their kind, but she looked like she'd been in a wrestling match.
Confusion ran throughout Laken's mind. Her emotions for him were overwhelming. She grabbed her prosthesis and pulled it on, fighting to adjust it, her fingers shaking and fumbling. That done, she looked at him, the polar bear with the uncharacteristic blue eyes. He shifted back into the man she'd spent the night with and had never forgotten. Why do you deny what we have? He asked again. A question he wasn't willing to let go of, clearly. I'm not the same woman. Hell, I hope not. It's been a few years. I'd like to think we've both grown up. She released a breath of exasperation. Fine. If he's not going to bring it up. No, she couldn't. So how did I end up undressed in front of him? Her panther screeched the answer deep in Laken's skull, snarling that he was their mate. Laken pushed the panther back, tuned her out. I made a mistake, she said, and pushed Ky away too. Then she leaned on the bar stool and shoved one foot into her pants leg. Laken. No. She zipped up her pants and grabbed her bag. Don't go. But she did.
Chapter 11. Sleepless. That described Ky's night to a T. Not a bit of sleep, tossing and turning, unable to get Laken off his mind. Her leg. What had happened? Was that what was creating a problem for her? Did she think it mattered? Surely she wanted him. Her body had told him so, with every scent it emitted. Maybe it was her heart. Maybe she didn't want him the same way he wanted her. He was walking into the SSC building, just as David pressed the button for the elevator. They entered the car together. Hopefully, the judges will have a decision today. Unanimous would be nice, but even a majority will work. David pressed the button for the 8th floor. Let's hope. David, there's something I need to clear with you. Just so you know. Ky rolled his neck, wishing the tension away. Go on. I know Laken Araya. From a few years ago. I met her at a social event, but we hadn't seen each other again since then. Not until the hearing. None of that was a lie. Ky released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Why does any of this matter? Who cares if two grown-ups met each other under those kinds of circumstances? Laken cared. And that meant he cared. I don't see an issue. If you haven't seen her in a few years. How many? 3, I guess. 2 years, 10 months, and 26 days to be precise, but who's counting? There's no issue, but thank you for letting me know. I'll note it in the files, in case anything ever comes up. David shrugged. Fedor Kozlov seems to be fairly persistent. Fairly so. Ky made a short detour to his office to respond to a few emails, then headed down to room 408. It was mostly empty, except for a few spectators who wanted a prime seat, most of them sitting on the same side as the respondents. Laken, Benedict, and Dale were assembled in the same room they'd spent way too much time in yesterday. Laken wasn't about to change her mind on the matter. It was fundamentally wrong to part a child from its mother when there was no good reason to. She wished that Fedor Kozlov hadn't made this a black and white issue. She wished he'd at least been willing to accept some sort of visitation. So, anyone have a change of heart? Benedict glanced from her to Dale, then back again. Laken shook her head. Dale coughed. I did. Do tell. Benedict leaned back in his chair, taking a drink of the coffee Secretary Parley had brought them. I'm not voting for Dominic to be taken from his mother. And since Mr. Kozlov isn't willing to compromise, then I'm siding with the respondent. Laken wanted to cheer that little Dominic's life wouldn't be upset, but at the same time, she felt sad for Mr. Kozlov. He wasn't even giving having a relationship with his grandson a chance. Not with this behavior. So it's 2-1, Benedict said. At least it's over. They made their way to the hearing room, and just as he had the day before and every day before that, Secretary Partley rang the bell, then announced them, and they made their way in. First Benedict was called, then Dale, then it was Laken's turn. She glanced around the room, allowing her gaze to land on Ky for the briefest of seconds. His expression gave no sign that he knew her. Though that should have relieved her. She'd have been lying if she didn't admit it crushed a part of her to have him treat her like she was just another stranger. Secretary Partley stood. Please rise. Everyone rose to their feet, the room silent except for the rustle of clothing. Secretary Partley faced the judges. Have you reached a decision? Benedict cleared his throat. We have. 2-1, in favor of the respondent. Ky couldn't say he was disappointed, but he kept a poker face. A clattering sound, wood on wood, turned heads toward the petitioner's table. Fedor Kozlov was rising to a stand, albeit not very gracefully, his cane banging against the table, then falling to the floor. Ky leaned forward to collect it, then handed it to the old man. Please sit, Mr. Kozlov. Ky's voice was low, but shifter hearing made it impossible for Laken and the rest of the room not to hear. I will not sit. I can see the writing on the wall. There will be no justice. None at all. Mr. Kozlov, this is the way of these proceedings. It's the way things are done. It prevents the loss of shifter lives. It wouldn't serve the shifter community for our kind to seek vengeance under the guise of justice. You agreed to these proceedings. They are a sham. A complete sham. And it's rigged. I know it is. Marty Lee rose to her feet. I won't let this happen. I won't have my son's life ruined because of one bad seed. How dare you call my son a bad seed? Kozlov's voice was strained, his color faded to a pale greenish white. Do you know what your son did? Marty's voice was strong. She glanced at her son. Take Dominic out of here, she told Tanner Navarro, the large grizzly by her side. Little Dominic shook his head. He didn't want to leave his mother. Just for a moment, she told him. Go for a moment. The boy nodded and left the courtroom. Your son. Marty's strength seemed to have returned. Her voice was filled with conviction. Your son raped me. She pointed at Fedor Kozlov. He hurt me. He gave a bad name to both shifters and men. Fedor Kozlov slammed his cane on the table. No. You wanted more information. Well, here's your information. He never wanted the son I gave birth to. The son he rejected. He laughed when I told him he had a son. And then he raped me again. A shuddering, silent sob racked her body. She buried her face in her hands for a brief moment. He said the most horrific things to the man who has been a father to Dominic. He said terrible things about me. Ky looked at the old man next to him. His bare senses picked up the man's rising pulse and the scent of his anger, but there was something else. Kozlov raised his voice above Marty's. I demand satisfaction for my son's honor. For my family's honor. Shit. This is going downhill fast. David stepped toward Kozlov's table, and at the same moment a blond man strode to the front of the room. I am Vane Kozlov, brother to Vay, uncle to the little one known as Dominic, and I am son of. He turned to look at Fedor Kozlov. You're no son of mine, old man, Kozlov exclaimed. His cane punctuated every word with a resounding whack on the desk. Nonetheless, I must stand up for what is right, Vane Kozlov said. This is wrong. Vay was full of bad. The old man's face paled even more. His hands gripped the cane as he rose to his feet slowly, his body shaking with the effort. You already said I am no son of yours. What more do I really have to lose? The room was silent. The scent of dissension was thick in the air. A sudden noise, like the sound of someone choking, broke the silence. The old man collapsed to the floor, his head striking the corner of the table as he fell. The room erupted in a frenzy of activity, several people reaching to assist the elder Kozlov. Ky's eyes locked with Laken's for an instant before he knelt to see to Fedor Kozlov. Chapter 12. Fedor Kozlov was rushed to a shifter infirmary in the area. Secretary Partley released everyone else, calling the hearing to a close. Laken didn't know where Ky had gone. He'd left the room with Vane Kozlov while Fedor was being carried out. Perhaps he'd accompanied Fedor Kozlov to the infirmary. Tired, she took a cab, splurging on the fare because she didn't feel like dealing with the subway. 30 minutes later, she was at home, had taken off her prosthetic leg and shifted into her panther form. She lay on the carpet near the fireplace, letting the warmth lull her. I could still make it to Cozumel. Enjoy a day or two before Africa. Except, she didn't want to go to Africa. She didn't want to do anything but think of that damn polar bear shifter, Malachi Romanoff. Ky. She savored his name in her mind, letting it roll around. Ky. How had she forgotten? He told her that night, long ago, at the clubhouse, after they'd had sex and then more sex, and they'd avoided making promises or saying anything that had anything to do with the future. Her shoulder muscles heaved in an exhaled chuff. She rolled over and stretched. A knock sounded at the door. She froze mid-stretch. She wasn't going to answer it. No way, no how. Another knock. She concentrated her shifter hearing, but couldn't pick up anything, not even breathing. Pressure pushed on her mind. Someone was nudging her to sync. Wanting to open up a communication link. Only a shifter could do that, only a shifter who was in their animal form. That was dangerous for that shifter. If a shifter were caught in its animal. Oh hell. She ignored the request to sync and shifted into her human form, then jerked her prosthetic leg on with a grimace. She yanked the door wide open and was faced with a wall of white. Thick, luxurious white fur, and attached to a polar bear that was standing on two legs, eclipsed her view of the hallway. Ky. He pressed forward, his bulk pushing her into the apartment. He stayed in his polar bear form as she closed the door behind him, and then he shifted into his human form. That's dangerous, you know. What if you get caught? You wouldn't open the door. I had to take a chance so I could talk to you. I have to pack. She looked away, not wanting him to read the lie in her eyes. She didn't have to leave just yet. His bear took her scent in, the denial, the desire, and held it in Ky's lungs, trapping that scent where it would infuse his senses and overpower his logic. All he could think of, all he could breathe, all he could understand was her, Laken Araya, his mate. His only mate. Fated for him, destined for him. Denying him. He would not be denied, nor would his bear. A growl began deep in his chest, sparked by her essence. He put a finger under her chin and tipped her head back until she faced him. His eyes bored into hers, his bear confronting her panther, assuring the feline behind that amber glow that what she knew of him was true. The scent grew stronger, her femininity and her desire prevalent. Deny you feel what I do, he dared her, his gaze more of a glare, his bear demanding his mate's surrender. I didn't say I want you. She hadn't said she didn't. Ky looked at her lips, lips he wanted to kiss, lips she was sucking in and biting on, though her eyes challenged him. This woman would never be easy to deal with, but she'd always be worth it. He felt her pulse surge with a burst of energy, and without removing her eyes from his, she drifted her hands to her buttons. She flicked them one at a time, until the fabric of her shell-pink shirt parted, yielding creamy skin cupped in lace. The darker rose of her nipples was outlined behind the lace, pebbled and eager for his touch. Her eyes still challenged him, as if she were taking his measure, as if she were trying to determine if he was there for the duration or if he would run. What the hell happened to her to make her like this? That question was driven from his mind when he heard the gnashing of the teeth of her zipper separating, then the rustle of fabric dropping as her pants fell to the floor. The aroma that the motion released created a throb in his hardness that was matched by the drumming of his pulse in his ears. She was undressing for him. Laken closed her eyes. Fingers tugged on her panties, pulling them down over her thighs, over her legs. Hands under her arms raised her, picking her up. Eyes still shut, she felt herself being lifted then placed gently on a cold countertop, making her flinch. With warm fingers against her thighs, Ky pushed her legs apart gently, with a reverence that surprised her when she thought of the man she'd been with all those years ago. I won't break, she whispered, wanting him to be how he'd been that night, wanting things to be how they were, wanting herself back. I know that. His breath was warm against her inner thighs, making pleasure whip through her, its tendrils touching nerve endings that were almost virginal again after all this time. Will you ever tell me what happened to your leg? Ky rose up on an elbow. A landmine. Not long after that night. In all my time in the military, I never encountered that. Shifters heal. Shifters heal when there's something there to heal. Point made. He planted a gentle kiss on her thigh. His hands cupped her heels, pushing them up, bringing her feet to rest on his wide shoulders. Emotions battled within her, arousal coupled with the shame of being on display with the lights on, the shame of having her leg on display. No one had ever seen her this way, not naked and with her weakness in plain view. She bit down on her lip. Everything was silent. Her shifter hearing couldn't pick up any sound of movement. She warred against opening her eyes. Beautiful. His fingers traced the flesh of her thighs, starting at her hips and drifting upward, leaving a trail of goosebumped flesh behind. As he approached her prosthesis, she closed her eyes tighter, her breath frozen, lungs burning from a need to pull more air in. He made circles with his fingertips, tinier and tinier. "Open your eyes," he growled softly. She shook her head. "I can't." The tortured whisper was ripped from her. "You will." His voice was harder. "Look at me." Laken wanted to surrender. She wanted to believe that she didn't have to worry about judgment. His fingertips lifted from her flesh, leaving her cold and wanting. Was he going to leave? Her eyes flew open, expecting to see his back. Instead, she saw his face, his gaze focused on her. "You have to trust me." He leaned forward and kissed her just above the prosthesis, then kissed the other leg in the same place. "Trust me." His breath felt like a shot of whiskey, warming her on the inside, spreading comfort through her. He pushed her legs farther apart, then cupped her ass, pulling her closer, spreading her more, both at the same time. Ky leaned forward, and she found herself arching closer to him, leaning into him. His tongue lapped at the point where her thigh joined her hip, long strokes that caressed that sensitive skin, making her muscles clench deep inside. The groan that came out of her mouth didn't even sound like it was hers. It was another woman's voice, another woman who was giving in to Ky. A woman with so much to give. He looked up. "Give it to me." That familiar flicker of gold highlighted his eyes. He'd taken his full bottom lip into his mouth, holding it captive with his teeth, making her wish she was the captive one. She knew what he wanted. Could she risk it? Could she put herself on the line? Toss caution to the wind. "Laken." His face was so close to her nether lips that she could feel his breath as he spoke. "A woman as brave as you are, who does what you do." He placed a kiss at the point of the triangle she kept trimmed for no one but herself. "A woman as brave as you, and you're running away from your emotions." Another kiss. This time he kept his lips planted. This time she felt the throb in her clit, a swollen barometer of her desire for him. He leaned forward. His tongue found her inflamed clit and traced a circle, wicked and wanton. She raised her hips in response, pressing her mound closer to his face, her muscles bunching, her core flexing for him. With long, slow strokes of his tongue, he teased her folds, flicking her clit with a tip, then sucking in her lips and releasing them with a sound that made her muscles tighten with yearning. Stroke after stroke, never going in, just teasing her, lapping, taking, passing so close to the place she needed him to be, and yet never yielding to her desire. Tension rose, cresting and peaking, not allowing her release. When he released a breath on her moist heat, the sound that came from her throat was primeval, a begging sound that betrayed her. Ky's hands, large and strong, a soldier's hands, a protector's hands, cupped her ass and pulled her closer until he'd covered her sex with his mouth, so he could devour her. She ground herself against his face, her fingers buried in his short hair, her nails digging into his scalp. With a quick plunge, he sank his tongue deep within her. A rasping cry spilled out of her as his tongue began a thrusting tempo that matched her heartbeat. God, yes. No. Yes. No. She couldn't put a thought together, her body completely surrendering to the sensations his worshipping yielded. One whimper, one scream that she bit back, and her eyes were closed again, starbursts and flares going off inside her eyelids. She shuddered as aftershock yielded to aftershock. Laken opened her eyes. Ky was watching her, and it was the Ky from so long ago. Or maybe it was that she was the Laken from so long ago. Laken's scent, her arousal, her climax, all of it surrounded Ky. Her taste was fresh in his mouth. Her emotions were raw in her eyes. This was so much more than the one-night stand they'd shared. She'd allowed herself to become his, and he wanted to take it to the next level. He wanted her to be his forever, just as he and his bear knew she was. Her panther knew. Laken was the only one who was late to the program. He looked down at the stunning display of her sex, glistening with the evidence of her orgasm. She studied him, as if she wasn't sure what to expect. He pulled her off the counter, spied a bed through an open door, and carried her there, then dropped her on the dark red bedspread. She lay there, propped on her elbows, eyes glued on him. Silent. Ky stripped with the brutal efficiency of a field soldier and crawled on top of her, not allowing his body to touch hers. He knelt in front of her and touched the hardness of his length. Her eyes were glued on his cock, a hunger in their depths. He rubbed the head of his cock, spreading the precomb. When her tongue made a tiny appearance, peeking out just enough to moisten her lower lip, he lost it. He lowered himself, pushing her down, arranging his body over hers, feeling her moist heat rising to greet the swollen head of his cock. Taking her hands, he lifted them over her head and tucked his cock against her opening, then stretched her slowly, pressing himself deeper, controlling the beast in him that wanted to rip through the motions and claim her with a ferocity that wouldn't be denied. He thumbed her clit as he eased himself deeper until he was buried to the hilt, fully encased in her, sheathed in heat and slickness. Her grunt as he buried himself deep was fuel to his need. When she started to move her hips, rocking against his, pushing him deeper and deeper, drawing him in then releasing him, he ground his teeth to keep from releasing. How could he tell her he hadn't been with another woman since her? He'd fantasized, dreamed, wished, and hoped for something like they'd shared. No woman could compare to her when she was clothed. He knew no woman would compare to her naked. He began to match her rocking with long, slow strokes, measured drives that were meant to control his escalation. She groaned. He covered her mouth with his, drinking in the sound, swallowing her passion, allowing her to taste herself on his lips. He fully wrapped himself around her as he picked up the pace, driving deeper. Deeper. Harder. Faster. When she cried out his name, her eyes open and dark with that amber flame in her depths, he went over the edge. Say you're mine. Say it. Forever. Now. Every word was pushed out of his mouth, propelled by his passion, ripped from his chest. I'm yours, Laken whispered. Forever, he growled. Forever. With a roar, he sank his teeth into her neck, puncturing the flesh, making her his with the eternal couple bond of his kind. Laken took a long, deep breath, careful not to disrupt his rest. He'd bonded with her. The delicate pain-pleasure of the bite, followed by his tongue's long, rough draw against the torn flesh, had made her climax again, releasing her from her battle, surrendering her to the love she knew he offered. You're mine, he groaned in his sleep. He flung his arm around her. She couldn't argue with that. She'd always been his. All of her. Chapter 13. Are you ready? Ky stood in the doorway, watching Laken doll herself up in the mirror. He couldn't get enough of watching this woman. Every expression she made, every curve of her luscious body, every nuance of her character, all her strengths, her weaknesses, all the things that made Laken Araya who she was, were the exact same things that mesmerized Ky. She looked at his reflection in the mirror and grimaced. Hello. The grimace turned to a nervous smile. Forgive me for being anxious. I'm only meeting your family for the first time. She stuck her tongue out at him. You need something to do with that tongue. He stepped up behind her and cupped her ass, his lips on the nape of her neck, just beneath her updo. Laken swiveled around. Malachi Romanoff. I guess I should be glad you remember my name, finally. He kissed her hard, destroying the careful application of lip gloss he'd watched her make. They'll love you, he assured her. Anyway, they have friends visiting from out of town, so the pressure won't be on you as much. And will your brothers be there? Should be. You've already met Isaac. Jonah should be there too. He wasn't last week. Missing 2 weeks in a row is risking a steep penalty with Aunt Miriam. She nodded, her expression serious. I hope they like me. She put her palms on his chest and pushed him gently. Now go so I can repair what you messed up. 45 minutes later, they were walking through Uncle Mikhail and Aunt Miriam's door. Ky took a deep breath. Grizzly. He scented grizzly in the air. More than one. The only grizzlies he'd seen in the city had been the respondents at the hearing. Following the sounds of merriment and the aroma of delicious food, he and Laken walked to the room. Welcome. Mikhail strode toward them and thrust his hand out. Nice to meet you, Laken. Aunt Miriam slipped in front of him. Hi, Laken. Don't let that polar bear gruffness get to you. I'm so glad to meet you. She wrapped her arms around Laken and looked at Ky over Laken's shoulder. She winked at Ky and gave him the smile that told him she was happy with something he'd done. He'd seen that smile many times during the years that she'd been like a mother to him, but this time, more than any other, it struck him deeply. He was glad she was happy for him. Hey. Layla peeled Miriam's arms from around Laken. My turn. I'm Layla. That's Gavin. She pointed behind her. Gavin raised a hand in greeting. That was when Ky looked at the visitors. Tanner Navarro and Marty Lee and little Dominic. Another couple was standing next to them, a grizzly and a woman with dark eyes that had an indigo gleam in the background. Tanner turned toward his uncle. My friends from Bear Canyon Valley. Mikhail indicated the couple Ky didn't know. May Forrester and Doc Evans. May and I go way back. Way back, May Forrester added. I didn't know you knew these people, Ky said to his uncle. They were the respondents at my hearing. I knew them through May. I didn't want to put you in an awkward position. Ky nodded his appreciation. Nice to meet you, for real, rather than in the confines of the hearing, he told Marty and Tanner. There was something about the grizzly's straightforward gaze that reassured him. This was a good man. Likewise, Tanner said. Laken reached out and hugged Marty. I know it had to have been difficult for you. Tears formed in Marty's eyes. I'm glad it's over. Curvy. Mikhail pulled them aside. I'll visit with your aunt and get the dirt on you, Laken said, letting go of Ky's hand. There's no dirt? Ky gave her a mock frown. Oh, we've got dirt, Layla laughed. We've got lots of dirt. Ky, Tanner, and Mikhail made their way to the far corner of the room, where the luxurious bar, with its Italian marble and rosewood trim, was fully stocked with several bottles of Curvy. Gavin and Doc joined them. In the other corner of the room, Laken was making herself comfortable with his family and their guests. She glanced at Ky and gave him a small wave. He smiled. God, a week ago my life was so damned empty. How's the case? Ky asked Isaac as their uncle measured brandy into their snifters. Catch your cat burglar yet? Doc raised a brow. Cat burglar? Don't, Isaac cautioned Ky. Ky smirked. Don't what? Don't say that a shifter's looking for a cat burglar. He bit back a laugh. Too late. Mikhail laughed heartily. No luck. It's been quiet the last week. He's on hiatus, I guess. Even cat burglars take vacations, I suppose. Unable to contain himself, Ky laughed out loud this time. Ha ha. Isaac crossed his arms over his chest. Want to ride with me next week? Can't. Got to wrap up a few things. Going out of the country. What's this? Mikhail studied Ky's face. You're not going back into the military, are you? No, I'm going to Africa with Laken. I'm taking a leave of absence. Does your aunt know? Mikhail swirled the amber liquid. She's the one who told me I shouldn't think twice, that I should be where my mate is. Mikhail nodded. When will you be back? In about a month, right before Christmas. Stay in touch. Let me know if you need anything. His uncle was well connected, was even rumored to have some shady associations. Any chance that we'll hear from Kozlov again? Tanner asked Mikhail. I was told he's still in the hospital, still unconscious. If he wakes up, he could make a fuss, but the decision is irreversible. There's no such thing as appeals. It's cut and dried. He'll abide by it, or he'll face the consequences. Kai wondered out loud about Kozlov. Tanner's face grew serious. I don't think he wanted to live. I can't imagine any other circumstance under which someone would do the things he did. Understood, Gavin said. You don't have to elaborate. Kai felt bad for him. He knew what it was like to be pushed, just as he knew Gavin knew. Gavin had killed a fellow officer in the Sigma Epps unit after that officer made a bad call, and had most of their unit obliterated, including Gavin's little brother. How long will you be in town? Mikhail asked. We only came in for the hearing, Doc Evans responded. May will want to get back. You're coming to Dallas for the birth, right? Gavin's face, usually stoic, wore an expression of concern, and he looked across the room at Layla as if to reassure himself that she was still there and was still safe. We'll be there in time for that. Though I should shop around to find a replacement, or at least someone who can help me out and take over some of the travel. Couldn't Astra? Tanner asked. Astra, Doc's stepdaughter, was well trained to manage shifter healthcare. Doc shook his head. She's got her own issues to deal with. I'm not sure I want to put that kind of pressure on her. It's that or bring an outsider to Bear Canyon Valley, Tanner said. May's got some connections. Maybe she knows someone. A knock on the door interrupted them. Maybe Jonas decided to join us. Miriam hustled toward the door. Kai waited to hear Jonah's voice, but instead he heard nothing. Then he heard a name that gave him chills, Kozlov. He froze for a fraction of a second, then bolted, his supernatural speed taking him to the front door quickly to be sure that his aunt wasn't in harm's way. Tanner was hot on his heels.
Chapter 14. Laken saw Miriam detour from the appetizer to answer the knock at the front door. Then Kai bolted out of the room, Tanner right behind him. Puzzled, she looked at Marty, who shrugged. The two of them headed toward the front door after their mates. They didn't make it quite that far. Miriam, Tanner, and Kai re-entered the room, and with them was Bane Kozlov. Marty gasped at the sight. Laken took her hand in support, and then realized what she'd done and how it would look. He's going to think that we've known each other all along. Releasing Marty's hand, Laken stepped forward. This isn't what you think. Marty stepped back and put her hands on Dominic's shoulders, then placed herself in front of her son. I've already talked to Secretary Partley, Bane said. He's given me some insight into the situation. I didn't come here to perpetuate a feud or to start new trouble. May stepped forward. Then why exactly did you come? Her voice was level and not accusatory in the least. My father's still in the hospital. Losing Vay hasn't been easy for him. I wanted you to know that I don't hold a grudge. There was something wrong with my brother, and when he stopped taking his meds. He shook his head. I've always known that Vay was my father's favorite. We had different mothers. Bane shrugged. There were days he drove me to wanting him not to be alive. Bane hung his head as if he were ashamed for having had those thoughts. That's all I wanted to say. It must be tough. Marty's voice was colored with emotion, and tears shone in her eyes. Bane nodded. Maybe one day when things aren't so fresh. Maybe you'd let me see Dominic? And let me get to know my nephew? Maybe your heart can soften enough to let my father do the same. Maybe, she said. I'll go now, and leave you to your family celebration. Secretary Partley has my information, should you ever wish to contact me. The big man with shoulders that blocked a doorway, and blue eyes the color of the sky, turned and headed toward the door. Miriam walked him out, and closed the door softly behind him. When she re-entered the room, everyone was silent and reflective. We should have dinner now, Miriam said.
Epilogue. A month later. Ky had gotten darker from his time out in the sun. He was leaner too, now that he was away from the gym and not eating the same diet as he had before they came to Africa, though he was still muscle-bound and sexy as hell. God, way too sexy. Laken put her hand on his chest, high on the right side, where he'd gotten a tattoo 2 days before they left the United States. The tattoo commemorated their relationship. It was a poem she'd written, one he liked enough to have it inked on his chest. He placed his hand over hers, covering it completely and then some. Feel better? Just stiff from the long plane ride, but ready to see your family again. And mine. Her sisters had agreed to come to Sunday dinner at Miriam and Mikhail's. She'd missed them. She'd promised them before she left for Africa that she and Ky would make it a point to come home every month for a few days. Ky knocked on the door, and it opened immediately. Laken wondered if Miriam hadn't been standing right behind it, anxiously awaiting their arrival. Miriam hugged her as she and Ky stepped inside. "How are you two doing?" She let go of Laken and wrapped her arms around Ky's waist. "How was Africa?" "Great." Ky's smile was bright in his sun-darkened face. "You wouldn't believe how incredible it is to be there, to be a part of it all, and at the same time, it's so sad. I've never seen you so happy. Come in. Almost everyone's here." She took Laken's hand, including Karina and Cadence. "And they've missed you." "Almost everyone?" Ky asked. "Let me guess, Jonah's not here." "Oh no. He's here. This time it's Isaac. He said he'd be a few minutes late. Something to do with a case." "Did May and the others make it safely back to Bear Canyon Valley?" "No incident, thankfully," Miriam said. "And we've seen Bane twice. He had lunch with your uncle once, and dinner with both of us last week." Carrie and Cade popped out of the other room and grabbed Laken in a hug. "I'm glad you're home," Carrie squealed. "Tell me you're staying through the holidays." "Yes, say you are," Cade insisted. Mikhail handed Laken, Cade, and Karina each a glass of wine. "Merlot. You'll love this one if you're a fan. It's a special edition." "We're staying through." Laken laughed. "What have you two been up to?" "Just work," Carrie said. "You?" Laken looked at Cade. Cade shrugged. "Work mostly." She took a sip of the wine. Behind them, the door opened. "Isaac." Miriam ran to the door and hugged the big polar bear shifter. "You made it." Laken studied Ky's brother. If possible, he looked even more worn out than the last time they'd seen him. "How's the case?" Ky asked his brother after giving him a shoulder hug. "Goddamn cat burglar. Things escalated shortly after you left. But I think we may be getting close." "What?" Karina said to Isaac. "I'm Laken's sister." "Karina." "Carrie, preferably." "Isaac." He shook her hand. "What's this about a cat burglar?" Carrie asked. "Isaac's with NYPD. He's a detective." Miriam beamed with pride. "Let's go into the living room. We've got appetizers galore." "Special task force," Ky added. "Quit that, you two." Isaac shook his head, then said to Carrie, "I've been working on the cat burglar case." "You said you were getting close." Carrie probed. "Do you still think it's a shifter?" Ky asked. A crash, the sound of glass shattering, made Laken flinch. Cade's wine glass had broken into tiny bits and had sent red wine splatters out in a wide circle. Cade's obsidian eyes were wide, her olive skin pale. "Sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what happened." Miriam patted her on the shoulder. "Don't concern yourself. It's an easy fix. I'll be right back." "Let me help." Cade trailed her toward the kitchen. "Is she okay?" Isaac asked, following her with his eyes. Laken noticed the amber of his bear in the depths of his eyes. Was it possible? Could he and Cade be Ky was watching her, a smile on his face. I saw it too, he whispered, taking her hand. Is that something we want to discourage? Good luck with that, he smiled. Isaac's as headstrong as I am. Laken rose up on her toes and kissed him on the lips. I wouldn't have you any other way.
Thank you for listening. This has been a Shifters Forever Worlds book by L. Thorne. Stay tuned for more episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and to ring the bell to be notified of new releases.